Welcome to Coffee and History, a conversation with Alabama Heritage. We are your hosts, Rebecca Minder,
Susan Reynolds,
and Caroline Gazera McKenzie.
Join us as we sit down with some of the most fascinating figures in the historical community over a hot or a cold cup of coffee. We explore the captivating tales of Alabama, stories that educate, inspire, and hopefully entertain. We are thrilled to have you here with us, and today we have taken our podcast on the road. We are recording from the beautiful and historic Scott Yarborough House, also known as Pebble Hill in Auburn, Alabama. And this home serves as the location for the Caroline Marshall Drawn Center for the Arts and Humanities. And we thank its director, Mark Wilson, for allowing us to visit for a few days and interview some of the great folks from this part of the state. And Susan, I think you have a great did you know fact for today.
I sure do. Listeners, before introducing our guests, we like to call this our Did You Know segment, where we'll share a fun and surprising fact about the state of Alabama, something that might be new information for you or even for us. So today's Did You Know? Did you know that Auburn University had begun an affiliation with the Methodist Church before the Civil War? Due to dire financial straits, the church transferred legal control of the institution to the state in 1872, making it the first land-grant college in the South to be established separate from the state university.
And for our listeners, and our guests might be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, a land-grant college or university receives federal support, and the original mission was to teach agriculture, military tactics, mechanic arts, and classical studies. And I'm sure our guest probably knows more about Auburn University than anybody that we know. And Caroline, who is our guest today?
Well, yes, I'm pretty sure he knows quite a bit about Auburn history. Today, we are excited to welcome our very own guest, Dr. Wayne Flynt, who is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Department of History at Auburn University and is the author of more than a dozen books. He is one of the most recognized and honored scholars of Southern history, politics, and religion, and has won numerous awards as an author and as a teacher. Please welcome Wayne Flynt.
Woo! Yay! Wayne, we're so glad to have you
You
here
sound
today.
just like my students when they were experiencing the trauma of one of my final examinations.
It's like, yes, we're so excited. This is our final test.
Well, to start off, so I did some research on you, just because I've never met you before, but you were actually born in Mississippi, correct?
That's right.
So what brought you to Alabama?
Well, my mother and father decided after 6 months in Mississippi they didn't want to live there any longer.
Oh, poor Mississippi.
So I'm a 6 months Mississippian,
Okay.
and the rest of the time I grew up my father was a salesman, and because he had never gotten a high school diploma, you took what you could find, and so we moved lots, 8 times between first grade and 10th grade.
Wow.
Different parts of the South.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always say that I became a Southern historian because I didn't realize where the boundaries were.
Right.
I knew you were in Florida, you were in Georgia, you were in Tennessee, you were in Alabama, but to the degree that I have a place where I can choose to call home, it was Anniston
Mm-hmm.
in Alabama. My father had been the son of a sharecropper who could not read and write, actually, and just north of Anniston in Calhoun County. My mother was from Birmingham, so I have the Alabama connections there.
Mhm.
And though we lived lots of other places in other states, we'd always find our way back to Alabama because both of them had families here. And as you know, in the South, families are really important,
Yes,
and
yes.
you don't want to be too far away from them. And so all I remember is almost like some dream you had. That then you were in Dothan, and then you were in Birmingham,
Yeah.
and then you were in Gadsden, and then you were in Sheffield, and then you were in Anniston 3 times.
Oh, wow,
Back
yes.
and forth. And so I really didn't have what almost all Southerners consider to be a normal childhood, where you have lots of relatives that come and visit, and you visit them, and parents, or if you have siblings, which I did not have, are part of your extended family. Our extended family was the three of us and Buster, my fox terrier.
Oh.
So,
Buster.
luckily, Buster lived almost as long as my childhood was lasted.
Oh,
And
that's
so,
good.
it was wonderful to have my feisty little bulldog, fox terrier, bulldog around, and there are obviously all sorts of bad things associated with not having a place
Mhm.
and not ever having things. When people say, "Where are you from?" you think, which of the 15 choices shall I use now? But actually, the nice thing about that is you get to determine where you're from.
Yeah.
And so I just tell everybody I'm from Anniston because it was my grandfather's sharecrop farm. It was my father's sharecrop farm. It was where my mother worked at the arsenal during the Second World War. And then when we began our travels all the way across the South, I found that really interesting. The problem is if you're an only child and your family's never in a place for more than a year or so, you have no friends.
It's hard to make friends too.
Yeah, well, a lot of people say, "You're awfully gregarious." And I say, gregarious was the way you survived as a child. If you were
Exactly.
not gregarious, if you didn't push yourself into somebody else's clique, you didn't have anybody who was a friend. So that's what I did. And it just so happened that on 3 occasions we were in Anniston. I started school in Anniston. And then I was in middle school for a year in Anniston. And then I begged my mother and father, could we just stay any place for 3 years so I can actually know somebody with whom I graduate high school. And that was one of those, serendipitous, it would be too small a word for it. Because when they took one look at my academic record at Anniston High School, when I was, I guess I was 15, they said, "We don't know what to do with you." And I said, "Well, you're not the first ones who told me that."
So are you saying your academic record was good or not so good?
Well, it's not like I didn't try. It's
Okay.
not like I work hard. But as you know, especially if you cross state boundaries, every place you go
Want
has
something
an
different.
entirely different
Yeah.
curriculum.
Mhm.
And so Anniston was pretty much like Dothan, but Dothan was nothing like Atlanta.
Right.
Atlanta was nothing like Augusta. And then when we went from Augusta back to Atlanta to a different school system in Atlanta, it was nothing like the previous Atlanta
Right.
system. And also, nobody's at the same place
Right.
in the
Mhm.
curriculum. And so all of a sudden you realize, this is the most boring thing I've ever done because I already know all this. I'm smarter than the teacher. And then the other times, they might as well be speaking Swahili.
Yeah.
For all the good.
Well, you know, the crazy thing is my background's very similar because we did move around a lot as well. And I mean, I was in Tuscaloosa. We moved around, I think, 8 times in Tuscaloosa in elementary school, but then I moved to Georgia and then we moved to North Carolina and then back to Alabama. And one of the so I can relate to what you're saying about trying to make friends and kind of honing your way in on different people's groups.
Same for me,
Um,
being a military child.
Right. And one of the things that, I was curious about with your upbringing is, my father died when I was young. And so my mom and I moved around a lot. And, my father came from a family that had servants and silver tea sets, that kind of thing. My mother came from the other side of the tracks, literally. And so at one point they lived in a boxcar and it was her parents and five children. And so, complete different dynamics in terms of, social class. When I was growing up, I never knew what I was. I didn't know if I was, when you're a kid, you don't think about class. You don't think about, oh, you're middle class or you're poor or you're rich or that kind of thing. And I think my mom worked really hard to make sure that I didn't feel poor even though I think we probably were. And so, you know, I was real curious if your background was similar to that. Did you ever feel like, you know, you knew 100% that, you know, I'm a poor person, or I'm middle class, or I've actually got more than others, so that might make me in a different level. So when you were growing up as a kid, did you ever think about that, or when did you start realizing where you fit in?
It's a great question, and especially you ask me because I spent so much of my time talking about class and race.
Right.
And in fact, if anybody said, well, what is the broad thematic structure of your history, writing, and research, it would be race,
Mm-hmm.
or religion, and class.
Yeah.
And so I'd have to say that we never really lived in a place where the people were much different from us.
Right.
And that was important. If we lived, for instance, in North Carolina, or if we lived in Oregon, or I think it would have been a very different story. Class would have probably mattered a great deal more. But you got to remember, I was born in 1940, so we're just coming out of the Depression. And it was not like there were a lot of rich people around the South, anywhere
That's
in the
true,
South
right.
in 1940. They were just trying to stay alive till the Depression ended, and then by George it ended, and the war began, the Second World War began. And so it was tumultuous. In fact, I remember one of the major training, Army training camps was right on the Alabama-Georgia line at Fort Benning.
Mm-hmm.
And we were traveling by train one day when I was just a little tiny kid, like 4 or 5 years old. And Mother and Dad had somehow gotten an Army uniform and an Army hat and had constructed it, and deconstructed it, and then made it again, sewed it again, so I'd have an Army uniform.
That's amazing.
So here I am, this little, I don't know, 5-year-old, I guess, traveling on this troop train with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, literally, of soldiers going to Fort Benning or coming back from Fort Benning. And I'm sitting there, and of course they're all handing me nickels and dimes because they have no use for them when they're going. And so I would take my hat off and walk down the aisle with them put up. I told somebody that I should have been a beggar. I had a PhD in begging, but I mean, they were so good and so nice and thought I was so cute. And so I had all these accoutrements of the military. And I was close enough to World War II, both in Anniston, which had a huge military presence, just dominating Anniston at the time in Calhoun County, and also the Fort Benning camp on the river. And so as a consequence of that, I was very much aware of wars. And like most boys who are fascinated with wars, you really think you want to grow up and be a soldier or a sailor or an airman, and that's what I really had decided I was going to be, that I was going to grow up and be a sailor, or I never learned how to swim, so I sort of moved that out
Well,
pretty quickly.
I think that's probably a prerequisite. You don't want to drown.
None of my family were swimmers. And so as a result of that, I thought, well, I'll be in the Army or the Air Force. And I finally settled on the Air Force, which I thought sounded a lot fancier. And the result of that was, growing up, you know, I had military uniforms and military bearing, and tried to obey everything people told me to do, which was probably not always a good thing, since some of the people telling me to do things were my peer group. But at any rate, it didn't really make any difference because you were never any place longer than a year and a half anyway, so you disappear. And as I say, my father was from Anniston, and he knew lots of people there. He was, unlike my mother, who was very quiet and reserved, Dad was very extroverted and enjoyed having alcoholic beverage from time to time with all of his uncles and cousins, and there were plenty of those. And so I grew up in this very typical Southern extended family where everywhere you looked there were relatives. And I remember when I started I started dating when I was in Anniston in high school. I had my first date, in fact, when I was about 16, I guess, which also is kind of backward when you think about it nowadays. But I remember my dad saying, don't do anything that would embarrass the Flynts.
Oh.
And I told Dad, what could I possibly do in Calhoun County that would not be known by everybody in the
Somebody
county,
should
since I
see
had so
you.
many
Right.
cousins and brothers and so I just decided, not brothers, but cousins, so
Yeah.
and so I decided that I just had to make my own way.
Right.
Right.
And they were, I mean, if Dad had picked some profession for me, the last one he would have picked is a preacher.
Right.
And that's what I wanted to be. And Mother was very sensitive and very church oriented. And so she was delighted that I wanted to be a minister. And so she's pushing me that direction. Dad is trying to,
Right.
oh Lord, no, let him be a preacher. I don't want to have to pay for his life.
I think a lot of parents are like that,
Yeah,
about their
yeah,
kids
sure.
and their education and where they're gonna go and, you know, where you're gonna end up. We always worry about our kids.
Oh, I know my
Yeah.
parents did, and I went into journalism, and I know that you worked for some newspapers,
I
correct?
did.
Yeah. What made you stop wanting to do that?
Well, I never really stopped wanting to
Okay.
do that. I love doing that.
Mhm.
I started with the Dothan Eagle when I was just
Okay.
a boy.
Yeah.
And it was the entree to one of the most wonderful periods of my life. Was at about 14, I guess. And in order to deliver my route, which was pretty much a rural route on the edges of Houston County, I had to get a motor scooter. And my mother was just fiercely opposed to me getting a motor scooter, but Dad was fiercely in favor of me getting a job. So off I go in my motor scooter, delivering papers.
Right.
And as I said, I think I was 14 at the time, and I felt like I was an adult,
Yeah.
you know, with that motor scooter and in control of it, and cars were blowing at me.
Oh, yeah.
I would wave at them. I don't think that's the way they wave back. But it was a world in which your parents were not too much afraid of you to get loose.
Yeah.
And it was the same way in Anniston, where Dad knew everybody.
Right.
And,
Sure.
so between Dothan, where I really made some wonderful friends, lifelong friends, at the little new Baptist church, which I was so fond of, and where I decided that God wanted me to be a minister. And that lasted just as long as I got to college, and on the Howard College campus in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, you realize the tension, the racial tension was just palpable. And I had already departed my culture pretty thoroughly on the basis of race. And the reason for that was quite simple. I was reading the Bible.
Right.
How can you reconcile apartheid and racial discrimination and consider yourself to be a Christian?
Mm-hmm.
And so already I had begun a sort of war of my own with the whole racial structure and the way in which religion had been used as part of that racial structure
Right.
to divide as opposed to unify. And I remember having fierce arguments with my father and my cousins and other relatives. Mother was somewhat more sympathetic to me because she was sensitive, and she went back to school long after they married. She had been the valedictorian of Jefferson County High School, which at the time was, there were only two white high schools in Jefferson County, one in the city of Birmingham, and then the county school was the one she went to. And she was valedictorian, so she was exceptionally smart. And nothing prevented her from going straight to college, except the fact she fell in love with my very handsome father, who was 3 or 4 years older.
So that's where you get your looks from?
Anyway, she graduated on Friday night and eloped and married him early Saturday morning.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Drove up to Tennessee, I guess it was,
Uh-huh.
where the Marion place was just across the border. And they got married, and then I came along, and so Mother's career as a teacher was ended by high school until I graduated from Stanford, Howard College at the time, and Mother, Dad had retired by then, and they moved to Birmingham, and Mother was fascinated by the campus, the Howard College campus, and so she began to ask me about going to college, and I said, "Oh, Mom, you want to go to college?" I said, "You're a lot smarter than I am." She said, "Oh, that's nonsense." I said, "No. I mean, you know, I've seen the data on you, and I guarantee you I didn't graduate. I was in my class and I was here." And so she decided to come back to college, and I never will forget walking out of the administration building at Howard College then. And my mother was with her best friend. She had persuaded her to come back, and she was about the same age, both in their 40s. And they were walking across campus, and the classes changed just at the time I noticed her. And so there was students just like ants moving across the concourse. And I said, "Hey, Mom!" And I waved at her, and she stopped dead in her tracks. She never turned around. And then she started walking again, and I didn't think anything about it until the next Saturday when I was out there having breakfast with him. And she said, "If you ever embarrass me again, like you did that day this week, you are not too old, and I will not push you over my knee, and I will whip your butt."
That's so funny.
So you mentioned that Howard College or Stanford University was once Howard College. What was that transition like? Do you know? Did you tell us?
It was really an interesting experience. It was a Baptist school first. It had been one of the oldest Baptist colleges, in fact. And when I went there as a ministerial student.
Mhm.
But in those days, the general rule for educated Baptist ministers was don't major in religion, because you're going to get religion in seminary.
Right.
So if you go to divinity school, that's all you're going to get.
Yeah.
And while you're in college, you need to broaden, you don't need to narrow. And I had taken that advice quite literally. And while we were in Anniston, the last time we went to Anniston, a wonderful woman from New England, whose husband was an officer in the Army, Janet Lefevre was her name, and she'd gone to one of the women's colleges, elite women's colleges in the North. And she had very little use for Southern ways and patterns of life anyway. But she was hired as a speech teacher, and she decided to introduce debate into the curriculum of the speech department, not just diction. And I never will forget the first time I was with her. She required a sort of conversation so she could find out what about your speech needed to be improved. And in my case, it was everything. And she said, "You are mushy-mouthed. You do not ever pronounce a T or a D at the end of the word. You just flatten it out." And so she gave me about a 30-minute lecture on how I did not know how to talk. And I was deeply offended that a Yankee was telling me I didn't know how to talk Southern, since I felt like I was a master of Southern. And the result of that was that we just became the best friends.
Oh, that's good.
And she had just started a debate program. And she said, "I want you to be a debater." I said, "I don't even know what a debater is." And she said, "Well, you're a Baptist preacher, and Baptist preachers love to fight and argue more than they enjoy doing anything else. That's what a debater is." And so I became a debater.
Oh my goodness.
And the background of this is the other person, the person who was my team member, was Don Stewart. And Don Stewart probably won't ring any bells for you, or maybe many of your listeners. But Don Stewart was a United States Senator from Alabama, who went to the University of Alabama, and from there became a very liberal United States Senator, so liberal that he only managed to go through one term before he was defeated by a racist opponent. But Don and I were the debate team, we were the affirmative debate team. And we won virtually every tournament we went to, and we went to tournaments all over the United States, which was wonderful. We didn't go to the West Coast and the East Coast, but up the central part of the country, which was really the heart of college debate at the time. We just won tournament after tournament after tournament. You can imagine someone from the background I've described to you, and all of a sudden you're winning all these awards.
Right.
And you've got these trophies, and you don't even know where to put all the trophies because your mother says, we don't need any more trophies in our house. Go bring them if you win them. And so the result of that was that I was offered a debate scholarship to Howard College.
Oh,
Really?
And people often ask, well, you were a ministerial student, obviously that's the reason you went to Howard. I said, I went to Howard because they gave me a debate scholarship.
Nice.
And in fact, I started a debate team based on me and my partner. And we were one of, it's embarrassing to admit this, but we were one of the best debate teams in the country. And that included the Midwest, which was putting out the best debate teams in the country. And we debated, for instance, the visiting team from Cambridge University.
Oh, that's amazing.
They killed us. Because the British don't pay attention to facts, they just argue theory. And so they make you look like a fool, theoretically. And they were also 20 years older than we were.
Oh, wow.
But
They have more experience.
those kind of experiences not only restore humility to you, that you realize you're not the smartest person in the world by any match. And you realize that debate means one thing to the Brits. They don't care anything about facts. They argue your logic. They go after your primary premises and just rip them to shreds, and it doesn't make any difference whether all your evidence is fine or not. It's the British way of debate. And, I did keep in touch with those guys, but both of them wound up in Parliament, and one from the Conservative and one from the Liberal Party. But for a kid with my background that I've just described to you, to be debating a team from Cambridge when they're 10 years older than you are, doesn't make any difference whether they rip you up or not. It's just that, you're here.
Yeah.
Right.
And you realize there's a overflow audience here in front of you who think you do better than you really know you did. They're trying to get on your side, and that was a lesson too. That I had a lot to learn, and I thought by the time I got to college and was champion debater and won all the tournaments except when we debated the Brits, and, that I was really something. And that moment in my life is so memorable because it told me how much I had to learn still that I did not know. And I think more than any other single thing, that turned me into a lifelong learner. And it also taught me that a lot of the people who are teaching you things, like my father and mother, were teaching you life lessons that graduate school does not teach. It's about not feeling bigger than your britches, as mother used to say, that there are people who never had the chance you had, who would have been just as good or better than you if they'd had the chance you had. And of course, that was also my theological. Those are parallel tracks. Jesus basically taught the same thing. Don't feel too proud of yourself.
Good lesson in humility.
And what are you doing for the poor?
Yeah.
That's the judge you use. And that stayed with me.
Wayne, I wanted to ask you about, you've written so many books. Is there one book that, in particular, that you are the most proud of?
People ask me that a lot. And
Well, then we don't have to ask you. We can ask you a different
No,
question.
no,
Or it could change. It could evolve over
It
time.
doesn't evolve. It
Yeah.
really doesn't evolve. A lot of the books that people think I would be proudest of, I'm not proudest of. It just sort of rolled off my back. Once you learn how to do the research and that kind of thing, it just sort of, if you write 3 or 4 books on Southern poor whites and nobody's writing about poor whites, they're always writing about poor blacks and poor Hispanics, but not poor whites. And so if you're trying to give poor whites the same kind of break you give to blacks and Hispanics, and not just stop with their bigotry and their lack of sophistication and that kind of thing, you'll oftentimes find these amazing stories
Right.
of triumph, and oftentimes you run into people like I did, which were coal miners who were, and you talk about radical people, they'd shoot you in a minute.
Yeah, no, sure.
I mean, and they didn't care whether they killed a mine owner or not. You were not going to tell them too much to do beyond what they were going to put up with before, somebody was going to get hurt pretty badly. And so I realized that there was a sense of everybody capturing some part of themselves that they're not going to surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go beyond that, you've got trouble.
Right.
And I didn't have a chip on my shoulder or anything, but I also was not embarrassed to identify with the people I came from.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, just talking about writing books, if you really want a great book, listen to a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
And listen to the cadence and listen to the way a storyteller will not, he will not hurry a story,
Mm-hmm.
because the details of the story are sometimes more important than the story themselves.
That's true.
And you can't understand the story at all if you don't understand the way you get to the story. And so storytellers, and boy, we had a lot of them in our family because we didn't have writers.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot who, and I had aunts and uncles who were functionally illiterate and were the best storytellers I ever heard in my life. Grammar was not always right, but the story was brilliant. And so one thing I try to do in my writing is tell a story.
Right.
To me, history is telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the analysis of information. It's what is the core of the story, which the information only supports, but it's not the story.
Mm-hmm.
The core is what is the importance of this, what is the event. So, and for that, I relied really, as you can tell from my writing, Dixie's Forgotten People, about poor whites,
Right.
Poor but Proud, about
Yeah.
poor whites.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think this is really surprising either, because if you're a female and you have been put down all your life, it wouldn't be surprising if you start writing about being put down
Mm-hmm.
and about the kind of people who put you down.
And stuff that, well,
The kind of
stuff
effect-
that you know about.
Yeah, the stuff you know about, exactly.
Well, Wayne, we've really enjoyed having you here, but we have a few extra questions that we would like to ask you.
Sure.
This is a segment that we call Before You Go. So before you go, we do have a little different take on our questions. One of the things I want to ask you is, do you believe in ghosts?
No.
I mean, because Mark Wilson told us this house might be a little haunted. So you don't believe this house is?
I try to persuade my children they should believe that every time they come here, because that way they wouldn't tear anything up.
Right.
But on the other
Exactly.
hand, no, I don't. believe
Okay.
it.
Is there someone famous whom you would have liked to meet?
Wow. Yes.
They could be alive or dead. Anybody.
Yes. Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh,
that's a
that's a good
good one.
choice.
Yes.
Great
Oh.
choice.
And
She was the woman for all women
Mm-hmm.
in that she, I'm not going to say played a role, but she accepted a role. And she accepted a philandering husband.
Yeah.
And she allowed the philandering husband to philander. And then she became one of the most powerful women in American history, both through him and his guilt, and also through the initiatives that she brought forth. So that when people say the Franklin Roosevelt administration, I said the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Because it really was.
It really
Yes,
was.
it really was.
So,
well, do you have a favorite book or a favorite author?
oh gosh.
Not your book, but
Yeah,
anybody
you can
else's.
choose.
No. I enjoy just about, curiously enough, I enjoy Southern fiction tremendously, and as you can imagine. And it would be awfully hard to ferret out which of the Southern fiction writers I enjoy the most.
Sure. So many good ones.
The, I'm trying to deconstruct hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
It's a hard
Well,
question.
we'll just say that that's the genre that you like, is Southern.
Well, yeah, you can do that. And,
We can say whatever we want, I mean.
Yeah.
well, I really do think that I have found more incitement and imagination in Southern writers who write about poor whites and white fiction and white ordinary people, and I wouldn't want to necessarily reduce that to one single writer because
There's so many.
There's
there's
so
so
many,
many of
yeah.
them. But there is no, I don't think there's no doubt that if you took the genre of writing of every region of the United States, there would not be another genre writer writing where so many of the very best writers
I would agree.
wrote about poor whites
Mm-hmm.
and poor blacks.
Right.
And so, to me, poverty was not only the dominant story of the experiences of a whole race of people, two races, white and black Southerners, but in addition to that, it was the compelling way in which people who were never poor understood this is who we are. It may not be who we family are, but we are these people. And one generation after another, Southern writers just
We have the best stories.
the best stories. I love it. I love it.
Now, Wayne, are you an early bird or a night owl?
Wow. I think it's the periods of your life. I've been both.
Okay.
I started off by my mother and father were pretty rigid, and I was too. You got up early, Dad would get up around dawn, and mother would sleep a little later, but not much. And gradually, I outgrew that. But then, of course, when your academic life begins, it's basically, 6 or 7 o'clock until 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock. And hopefully some time in there for your family. And now that my wife's gone, I would say my biggest problem is going to bed. I just don't want to go to bed. You feel like you don't have anybody to go to bed with.
Right.
And besides that, there's another book to read. One more book to read.
That's right.
There's one more basketball game. So there's one more basketball game to watch.
That's right.
And so I would say sort of an ordinary single man again. And I have an awful lot of female friends, and I enjoy their company an awful lot, and spend a lot of time with them.
Absolutely.
But it is. I've told people many times that of course I was married for 50 years. She was older than I, and she got me when I didn't know any better. And we had this absolutely wonderful marriage because I just did what she said.
That's what my dad always said too. He said the magic words are yes, dear.
And if you've had one really wonderful marriage, you really don't look around
the
for
jackpot.
another
Yeah.
tired of that. And I don't mind being alone, and I enjoy writing, and that's it. My wife was the same in many ways, but one way she was the same was that she allowed me to write 15 books, and all of my books were written in longhand.
Wow, yeah, exactly.
And then I turned them over to typists to edit and
All that good stuff.
type, which was wonderful. And we really enjoyed travel outside the United States. And so, we were in People's Republic of China back when it was hard to get in. And matter of fact, my ring I wore today is from People's Republic, jade and gold. And she loved to travel, and we were friends.
Yeah. Well, has anyone given you, what's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten from someone?
I think it's fairly simple. my mother and dad, who didn't know what I was going to amount to, if anything, and both of them coming from very, very poor backgrounds. Mother was very bright, but she had an alcoholic father, so he had a college degree too, but he had wasted it after going to Harvard College and getting a degree. And mother and dad both had a piece of wisdom, which I've used with my sons too, which is do the best you can. I don't expect more of you than the best you can be, but I do expect the best you can be. And I really wish more parents would do that, because that allows the child to substitute into the story of their lives what they're capable of doing. And it may be at one period of their life they're capable of doing exceptional things. Another period of their life they're hardly, I mean, if they just get through a day, they've done
That's the
really
best
well.
you can do.
Yeah.
And I think too many parents have some sort of agenda when they ask the question, are you doing the best you can do? It's not the best the kid can do.
Right.
It's the best the parent thinks the kid can do. And
The
that's a
parents,
big
the
difference.
parents have high
Or
expectations.
the best that the parent thinks the kid wants to do.
Right.
And that's the biggest problem, because your assumption is that you're not trying hard enough,
Right.
because you really could do it if you wanted to. And I guess some people would say that as a father that I had sort of been hands off, but I was hands off on one son who wanted to be an aerospace engineer and was a brilliant student and very disciplined. And then my other son was a brilliant storyteller and writer of fiction and has written 2 wonderful books set in the Middle Ages of all
That's
time.
wonderful.
And he was never, he never satisfied teachers. They
Right.
always thought, you're not working hard enough, you're not doing enough. Well, he was working, but he was working
In a different
in
way.
imagination.
Yeah,
He
exactly.
was recreating an entire world
Yeah.
Yes.
and doing research to incredibly reconstruct that world to the most minute detail
Right.
by reading everything he could about what England was like in the 14th century.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Wayne, we have enjoyed having you as our guest
Absolutely.
today. So we thank Dr. Wayne Flynt for joining us. It has been quite an honor to
It
spend
has.
this time with you. And we thank you, our listeners and our viewers, for joining us on this edition of Coffee and History, a conversation with Alabama Heritage. As a reminder, you can find our podcast on our website at alabamaheritage.com, which is where you can also subscribe to our magazine. You can also listen to our podcast wherever you find your podcast, and watch us on our YouTube channel where we post extended video versions. So until next time, we'll see you. But for now, I think I need more coffee. So goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
That's it.
You should have said, and Wayne loves the show.
Actually,
Of course I do.
you're about to do
We
something.
will do that.
Yes.
She's gonna record you to do that.
I am.
If you'll do a little shout out promo for us.
Well,
Of course.
I will.
And then